We are currently in the midst of a really fun NFL season, with many NFL teams looking like true contenders and many NFL teams not looking like true contenders. However, in today's video, I want to focus in on a couple of teams that, in my opinion, are not contenders, rather they are simply pretenders. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, but let's hop right into it. Now, before we actually get into it, let's actually talk about what is a pretender. To me, a pretender is a team that has a good record or has a good history of being a good team that just this year has some sort of fatal flaw that is going to hurt them in the playoffs and cause them to lose either in the playoffs or potentially to miss the playoffs entirely. With that being said, I do have one honorable mention. This is a team that I think is borderline pretender, but also could be also considered a contender, and that is the Minnesota Vikings. I think their fatal flaw is that we just don't know 100% what Sam Darnold is going to look like in the playoffs, and their defense has kind of been getting figured out lately. So for now, they're simply an honorable mention, but they could also be considered a contender if you want to say so. But we are going to begin with, at number 5, the San Francisco 49ers. Now, San Francisco only has a 5-5 record this year, and their net point differential is only positive 28. They actually sit last in their division right now, but we all know that San Francisco is a contending-like team. This is a team that is a good collective group of talent with a good head coach, at least we think, and a lot of other really good qualities about it, and their history says so. I mean, last year they made it to the NFL Super Bowl, and they've been in a couple years prior. We all know that this is a good team, but yet we sit here 10 games through their season, and they're only 5-5, and I think a lot of us are starting to become a little bit more pessimistic on this Niners team. This team has a couple of major issues with it. Number one, and I guess one that they really can't control, is the injury bug. Obviously, not having Christian McCaffrey till just 2 weeks ago definitely hurt their beginning of the season, and now they have injuries to guys like Brandon Ayuk and several other pieces on their defense. I don't want to use that as an excuse for why the Niners are having such a tough start to their season, but it's definitely a valid excuse in my opinion. You look around the league and there's a ton of injuries, and the 49ers just happen to be one of those really good teams that is going through a bunch of injuries right now. Another issue this team is also going through, and I would say the second biggest reason why this team is struggling so much, is because Kyle Shanahan is not adjusting right now. This is a team that is getting absolutely buried with sacks and pressures, and they just aren't having much success against third down blitzes. If you can get the Niners into an obvious passing situations, you can dial up certain blitzes and it's going to succeed. And it's not necessarily because the offensive line is bad, it's just simply because the Niners have set protections. They don't change it on the fly. When a quarterback is up, about to take a snap, sometimes they're going to change the protection calls. They might want to shift their offensive line to the left to, account for a blitzer. They might want to shift, a tight end inside to help a chip blocker, so on and so forth. The Niners don't necessarily do that much. It's one of those things where Kyle Shanahan in the play call is going to have a set protection design for that Niners team, and they're going to run that design regardless of what the defense is running, which can be extremely problematic if, let's say, for example, there's a blitzer on the left side, but your protection plan is shifting your offensive line to the right. That means essentially that blitzer on that left side should be a free blitzer. I've seen plenty of times throughout the season where they're going to have 6 defensive linemen or 6 people inside the box, and they're going to send all 6 of the quarterback to overload the offensive line, and at least one of them is going to be able to get pressure on Brock Purdy. It's part of the reason why we've seen Brock Purdy run maybe the most of his entire career this current season. He's basically forced to run for his life and make game-changing plays. And Brock Purdy is a damn good quarterback. I think he's smart enough to make those protection changes, but they just, for whatever reason, aren't doing it. So for Kyle Shanahan, that's extremely worrying, especially when we talk about what could be to come if this team were to go on some sort of run and maybe go 11-7 or 11-6 to end the season off and, make it to a playoff spot. What would the playoffs look like for this team? Because I feel like teams would just continue to do that over and over again, and it would just be up to Kyle Shanahan to make the adjustments. However, moving on to number 4 is going to be the Atlanta Falcons. Now, this Falcons team, in my opinion, is super talented. I actually really like the construction of this roster, at least on paper. I think a good sort of guideline to base this Falcons team off of is kind of a similar unit to the Detroit Lions. Now, I think they're a different unit entirely, but they kind of have similar qualities to them. Let me explain. You look at the quarterback, I would say Kirk Cousins is pretty similar to Jared Goff. I think Jared Goff is maybe a better quarterback, at least this year, but in terms of what they actually do for an offense, they're both pocket passing quarterbacks that aren't necessarily extremely athletic. These are also 2 teams that have 2 very good running backs. For the Lions, you have Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. For the Falcons, you have Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. These are also 2 teams that have quality tight ends, Kyle Pitts, Sam Laporta. Also quality receiving rooms, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamison Williams, and for the Falcons, Drake London and Darnell Mooney. And you look at the offensive line, they're both pretty solid units entirely. I think the Lions are probably better, but pretty good units. The one key difference between these two teams is that one team is able to generate pressure and one team isn't. And unfortunately, that is going to be the Atlanta Falcons. The secondary for the Atlanta Falcons is actually not bad this year. I mean, you have guys like Jesse Bates, Justin Simmons, and AJ Terrell. All those guys are big name secondary members that are all really good players. I also think they have some solid linebacker play as well. The issue with this unit is that they are dead last in basically every single statistic when it comes to sacks, pressure percentage, and many others. Now, this can be fixed through schematics, whether it's through blitzing the quarterback or it's through designing unique stunts up front. But for whatever reason, this team just doesn't really do so, which is especially weird given the fact that their head coach is a defensive coordinator, essentially. I find it weird that this team is dead last in so many different sack percentages, sack rates, sacks in general, pressure percentages, and so many other things. Yet despite that, this team is one of the lower ranked teams in terms of blitzing percentages. I'm not saying you have to blitz on 50% of the downs because that's just unrealistic, but when the highest rates are like 30, high 30s, maybe even 40s, why aren't you doing the same thing, especially when you know that if you blitz, you're more likely to put more pressure on the quarterback? If you watch that Broncos game from last week, the Broncos essentially had 3-4 seconds every single time Bo Nix dropped back, so it was a bit essentially like him playing 7-on-7. If you can't get pressure on the quarterback, it's going to be so easy for defenses to dissect your secondary, which has been happening for this Falcons team. And I know in theory, some of the names they have on there, like Grady Jarrett and Matthew Judon, are good guys to have on your team, but that hasn't really been the case this year. Grady Jarrett hasn't been the pass rushing machine that he typically can be sometimes, and Matthew Judon, very much the same thing. They also had a chance potentially during the trade deadline to go out there and maybe address that position group. I don't know, you could have went out there and got a Max Crosby for God's sake, but they didn't do so. And I do think that this is a actual thing that could legitimately kill their chances deep in the playoffs because they simply just don't have the pass rushing unit to actually succeed against really quality teams. Would I love to be wrong? Yes, but I don't think I will be. Moving on to number 3, the Washington Commanders. Now, I love what I've seen from the Washington Commanders this year. This team has gone from being one of the worst teams in the NFL to genuinely being a really good and fun team to watch. However, this team does have some major flaws that, in my opinion, are kind of out of their own control, which is just simply this team is youthful and they're not really a cohesive unit, if you get my point. What I mean by that is this team had a major overhaul in the offseason, bringing in guys like Tyler Biadasz, Dorrance Armstrong, a new head coach, a new quarterback, some new running backs. I mean, a whole bunch of new pieces just basically in every single position. So this is a team that doesn't have the cohesiveness of, let's say, a Kansas City or a Buffalo or a Philadelphia per se. And I know maybe you guys think, oh, well, this team has good chemistry. Cohesiveness doesn't matter that much, but I kind of think it does matter, especially if you want to make a deep Super Bowl run. And I also want to emphasize that this team is also pretty youthful in major positions, mainly at the quarterback position. You're starting a rookie quarterback, and I don't know if there's ever been a quarterback that's ever made it to a Super Bowl run. Maybe a couple, but have they won it? I'm not too sure. For Jayden Daniels, I think he's an awesome quarterback. I think he's, as of right now, potentially a top 10 quarterback just simply in the league, not just out of the rookie class, but just out of the entire league right now. He's playing at that high of a level. He was in MVP conversations for many weeks into the season. And sure, he's essentially hitting a bit of a rookie wall right now, whether that's his fault or the play caller's fault. But I also just think we have to be a little bit more realistic about this Commanders team, because I've heard some people say that they're contenders when I don't think they quite are. In my opinion, you have to let this team sort of gel together, go through some disappointments and go through some, good moments. And I think that's what this season is for Dan Quinn and the Commanders. I don't expect Jayden Daniels to win Super Bowl MVP in his rookie season. That's extremely unlikely. So yes, they are pretenders, but I think within a few years, with Jayden Daniels playing better, the defense having more cohesiveness, the offensive line playing better, the running game being better, this is going to be a Commanders team that could be legitimately awesome for many, many years to come. But let's go ahead and move on to the Houston Texans at number 2. For Houston, I like a lot of things about this team. I love a lot of their offensive personnel, even some of their defensive personnel. I think this team, in paper and in theory, is a really solid unit. Unfortunately, they just have one major flaw. Before we get to that major flaw, let's actually go through the positives for this Texans team. CJ Stroud is an awesome quarterback. I know he's not having the greatest year that we all kind of thought he was going to have. Everyone was saying that he could take that MVP jump in his sophomore season. That's just a little bit bit unrealistic and just really high praise for a young quarterback. He's having a good year, just not as good as maybe some people thought he was going to have. Nico Collins is a total stud, probably a top 5 receiver in the league at this moment. I love Dalton Schultz. I love Tank Dell. I love Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon is having a fantastic season for that Texans team. And I think defensively wise, it's not the greatest unit in the league, but I like a lot of the pieces on there. Will Anderson is a stud. Daniil Hunter is a stud. Derek Stingley is a stud. I mean, they got studs all across the board. I like their head coach. I think he's also good. But this team just has a major, major flaw. And it's something that I don't know if it can be fixed, at least this year. And that's the offensive line. When your offensive line is getting just bullied day in and day out, it's really hard to have success. Now, I know this Texans team just had success against the Dallas Cowboys, but the truth about the Dallas Cowboys is they have one good pass rusher, and that's Micah Parsons. And if you block Micah Parsons, you're going up against third-string defensive ends and fucking Mozzie Smith. So yes, I do want to give credit to the Texans for what they did last week versus Dallas, but you also have to put into context that Dallas is not a very good team whatsoever. For Houston, if they want to make that dramatic run and that dramatic step forward towards being a Super Bowl contender, I feel like the offensive line has to be addressed. I feel like in theory and in the name value, the offensive line isn't bad when you look at the names, but when you look at the performance this year, it just isn't the case. That left guard position has been really, really bad, and they thought that Kenyon Green could be the guy there, but he hasn't really worked out, so they're putting guys like Juice Scruggs all across the offensive line, and they're not having much success there either. Laramie Tunsil, I think he also either leads or is one of the leaders in terms of penalties this year, and that's Laramie freaking Tunsil. That was supposed to be your anchor at your tackle spot. You've also had other issues with, the center, the other guard, Titus Howard. I mean, so many other these guys have had some struggling moments, and for a young quarterback like CJ Stroud to have to sit there and go through pressure on almost every single play, it's going to be difficult, especially when you get towards those better teams like potentially Baltimore or Pittsburgh or Kansas City. Because unlike this Texans team, the Steelers don't really have those same issues. They also have elite pass rushers to handle a team like Houston if they were to play. Same thing with Kansas City and same thing with Baltimore. Those teams have respective issues as well, but they're not like cancerous issues that could ultimately lose your season. That's what this Texans team unfortunately does have. So in the offseason, hopefully they can look to address that spot, because I feel like next year could really be the big step forward for Houston if they actually do address those positions properly. But at number 1, and I'm going to get a shit ton of hate for this, is the LA Chargers. Now, I know I have sort of this consistent, I don't want to say hatred, but consistent like negative press about the LA Chargers. I don't know how to word it, but I consistently usually just don't talk very highly on the Chargers, but I do want to give them their flowers. They're having a hell of a season given where I thought they would be. They are 7-3, second in the division, could win the division if they beat Kansas City, but I think we have to be realistic with this Chargers team, and I think even maybe Chargers fans would understand where I'm coming from here. This Chargers team is good. Justin Herbert is, he is awesome. He is awesome. That's all I'll say about Justin. He's awesome. I think Jim Harbaugh is also an awesome head coach. I think the offensive line is also pretty damn good, and they have a good running game with, J.K. Dobbins, and that defense is actually really good too. They kind of got exposed against Cincinnati, but Cincinnati's offense is awesome as well. So, you take what you can get. But here's the thing. The Chargers ain't got no damn weapons, and that's the truth, all right? Ladd McConkey, he is a great player. He's a great young guy, and I think he is the best weapon on this Chargers team. I think he's actually on pace for 1,000 yards, which is awesome. But if that's your only weapon, you're going to have serious issues in the playoffs. That's just the truth. I look at this Chargers season, and they haven't had a necessarily dominant win versus a good team. They did beat Cincinnati and handled them for the most part, and I want to give them their flowers. That was an impressive win versus a good Cincinnati team, regardless of their record. But I want to see how this team performs against a team like Baltimore or a team like Kansas City, which we will see later in the season. Again, I want to give them their flowers. They're 7-3 and having a hell of a season, and they are impressing me more than I thought they were actually going to. But when you have a receiving group of Quentin Johnston, Ladd McConkey, and some other names, it's not the greatest unit. You also don't have a consistent dominant tight end presence either. So you're simply relying on Justin Herbert to fit these throws into tight windows pretty consistently, or just simply Ladd McConkey. And I have a feeling once we get into the playoffs against these really good teams that have dominant pass rushes, you're going to see a team like potentially Pittsburgh get a lot of pressure on Herbert, and Herbert isn't going to be able to find Ladd McConkey because he's probably going to be double teamed. And so then if you're Herbert, you got to force the ball into those other receivers like Disley and Quentin Johnston, and I don't know how much success you're actually going to find in doing that. Again, I think this team is good, and the fact that they might make the playoffs is really awesome and really impressive in its own right. But in terms of this team being a contender, I don't think they actually are, but I think they're a really good team. But that all being said, if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.